Hello everyone. So today I am going to talk about Derek Walcott's poem Crusoe's Journal first and then Midsummer. My name is Dr. Ajanta Dutt and I am Professor of English at Deshbandhu College, Delhi University. This is for the MA English elective course at IGNOU. It's part of the New Literatures in English Caribbean Poetry series and the code is MEG8 Block 6. I'm starting my lecture with a quotation from Walcott's essay, The Figure of Crusoe, where he explains in quite a long paragraph what he actually means by Crusoe as a metaphor for his poem, Crusoe's Journal. He says, "My Crusoe then is Adam Christopher Columbus, God, a missionary, a beachcomber, and his interpreter, Daniel Defoe." You can read the rest of the quotation, but this is what he too sees in his own poem, because Crusoe is used as a metaphor for himself, for the self who is an adventurer, for the self who is searching for an identity. And we move over to the poem with this quotation, this explanation by Walcott himself. So when we look at Walcott as Crusoe, we look first at the themes and the style of this poem, where he is tracing the complex experience of colonization in the West Indies. He is looking at the aspects of survival for the native islanders, and he is also thinking as a poet and as an intellectual for the need for cultural transformation. Of course, he brings to his poem the poetic perception which comes through in meditative language, in a style which is incantatory, which is there in also several other poems. So as we have established, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe becomes a metaphor for Derek Walcott. In the poem, he is also merging the self of the poet, the intellectual, in that of Crusoe, and he is finding the present of the Caribbean islands in the comparison with Crusoe's literary adventures in Daniel Defoe's great work. Now, when we talk about Crusoe defined, we see him in Walcott's poem as a Proteus-like figure who, as you know, was the mythical god who could change his shape. You can see in the inset a picture of Proteus rising from the sea. As he adapts to the circumstances, Crusoe, in his own castaway status on the desert island, attempts to understand the new world, and so too does Derek Walcott. He understands the new world after colonization. So Crusoe represents the individual and also the community of the Caribbean islanders. We look at the title of the poem where Walcott speaks of Crusoe's journal. As we know, journal is the record of a personal experience, and thus this poem is a narrative of the poet's personal thoughts. Now we come to the figure of Crusoe, the self as merged with the literary figure. In his Nobel address titled The Antilles, Fragments of Epic Memory, Walcott spoke about shaping a culture. So when we look at the metaphor of Crusoe, we are looking at the disintegrating objects and symbols that were there in the native islands, because of course the native cultures were being rejected by the newcomers. The cultural fragments leading to a new perception. Here we see the vision of a new world, and therefore coming from the colonizers, the enlightenment and knowledge which comes from education and also the giving of a new religion. We see in Walcott's poem also the theme of loneliness. We see that Crusoe is a maker but yet he is all alone, just like the poet Walcott. There are, of course, autobiographical innuendos in the poem, as Walcott compares his inner self to that of Crusoe cast on that desert island. We look at the epigram that Walcott chooses from Robinson Crusoe, and I quote, "I looked upon the world as a thing remote, which I had nothing to do with, no expectation from, and indeed no desires about." This seems to establish the state of mind of the poet himself, because as we see Crusoe's outlook of the world, we are looking at the objective rather than the subjective. Quote, "lived in and come out of," unquote. But our poet Walcott reverses this notion in the poem. His perspective is subjective and it overrides the objective observations. Again, let's look at a quote from Walcott's poem. "Like those plain iron tools he salvages from shipwreck, hewing a prose as odorous as raw wood to the adze." This, therefore, then, is Derek Walcott's setting of the poem. A shipwreck of prose. That is, he is going to find something new and create a poem out of it. So we see the setting of the poem as, again, a deserted island which is devoid of other human folk, between the forest of Trinidad and the unending ocean. We look at the mind of the poet here, his intellect and his imagination. We see that he is looking at the questions and judgments that rise in his mind at the scenery surrounding him. He thinks of wreckage because Robinson Crusoe was cast on the desert island from the ruins of his ship, and there were pieces of wood and other flotilla floating around him. So, in the poet as well as Crusoe's wreckage, there is the writing tools of the author, which of course essentially are his words, and therefore Walcott is suggesting that he is rescuing poetry from prose. Now we come to the giving of a religion. This gathering and piecing together and putting together what he can find is suggested in the word timber, which is applicable both to wood and to sound, in fact, to the sound of music. Now, if we go back to that first quotation, Walcott is establishing to us that the first man, Adam, was given to his first naming, referring to Good Fridays, which is indicative again, one, to the Christian religion, and Good Friday being the most important day of Easter, and then again to Crusoe finding his man Friday on that desert island. Crusoe was naming the animals, and with each new word he was filling in the gaps of meanings that had not been known before. And thus, in Walcott's poetry, he too is creating a new world with words only as a poet can. So he is perceiving things afresh, and this is the world that has to be created and reconfigured. Now, in this poem, we find a number of quotations which are related to the new world. For instance, I quote, he says, "In a green world, one without metaphors, like Christopher, he hears in speech mnemonic as a missionary's the word to savages." So this quotation is also indicating the arrival of Christopher Columbus into the New World. In fact, as we know, Christopher Columbus landed in the West Indies. Now, when the colonizers came, they brought Christianity, which converted the natives to the new religion, and this is indicative again of the metaphor of Crusoe and Friday. There is also the metaphor of the servant and the master, which is borrowed from Daniel Defoe. The word also indicates teachings from the Bible. And this alters the cultural circumstances and the pagan religious beliefs of the natives on these indigenous islands. Therefore, Derek Walcott is giving to us the language of the masters, the languages that they used in order to convert and recreate, and this we see as the hegemonic force not only on these islands but all over the colonized world. There is also the suggestion of a kind of cannibalism, as these natives are asked to participate in the Catholic communion service, where there is the eating of the quote-unquote flesh of Jesus Christ, and therefore they are in a sense exchanging what they knew before to something that is new and is a metaphor for them that will bring to them untold blessings. So when we look at all shapes, all objects, we are seeing Derek Walcott showing us that everything comes from the sea. We know how important sea is in his poem. Multiply and change, that is the shape that is attributed to Proteus. And the sea also represents Caribbean history because it is a repository in their geographical space of their history. It contains the cultural object and shape of human life and the history of the islands, which is all but forgotten. We look at the adventure and loneliness of the journey, and we look at memory, which he signals as one boy signaling at the sea's edge. Now, Walcott was driving along the coast road, and when he says that there is a stuttering canvas, he is talking about the sense of sound and sight, but there are the broken, hesitant speech idioms of the poor natives on these islands. The scenes pass by quickly as in a film, and as he passes the native villages, the settings, he sees this area from a children's perspective, just like the story of the Treasure Island. Or he also mentions other authors like Henty. They were all writing children's books. So the metaphor of the castaway and the lonely boy, is that Walcott himself? Indeed it is, because he is talking about a childhood that is perhaps lost or tucked away, and he is playing on time, present and past. In it there is also a history that is lost, and it needs to be given new shape, new meaning. So poetry is like divine speech coming from the Creator, and when he uses the simile of the gulls, which is alliterative, this is breaking the sound of the silence and the desolation that surrounds him. Poetry also demands a voice and praise, and like the gulls, it cries out because it must be heard. We remember that Aristotle said that all art is mimesis, and here too, poetry is part of that art which is recreating the sounds of the universe. Now here we also have his comparison to Ben Gunn, who of course must reconcile with the isolation of the island. And this is Stevenson's work creating an influence on Derek Walcott's poem. So when he talks about the half-cracked Ben Gunn and Oh Happy Desert, he is really telling us that there are lessons to be learned in the West Indies, and a new culture must be created from the wreckage of the old. So we see that the settlers are also a part of this island experience, and in the aftermath of the colonization, this entire experience is coupled with a sense of exile for the poet. We also then see that this reconciliation through the intellect leads to a new discovery of the world, or should we say a discovery of the new world. We see the children as childish thoughts versus mature thoughts, because the world needs masks to give it shape and meaning. In a sense, Walcott suggests that we are all Crusoes, we are all castaways and beachcombers longing to find our personal Garden of Eden. We are also searching for faith like the first man, Adam. And therefore, the naming, experiencing and comprehending meaning in this new world is up to each of us to discover. Sometimes comprehension comes through unorthodox or native beliefs. And there we wonder, is Walcott talking about heresy? That the indigenous islanders, if they think of their pagan religions, that would be considered heresy? Finally, we come to the last line of the poem, which is a pantheistic reference to God, God being omnipresent and there in all objects all around us. We see the symbol of what the poet creates, which contains meaning and loneliness, and we feel a separation that God feels with his own creation. We also observe the Christian imagery that is redolent in the poem. There are several points here that you can read in the essays by Walcott and in his poem, The Sea is History. And you may also see Louis Buñuel's film, Robinson Crusoe, where he focuses on the island story. And in that film, we see the survival in the desert island, and also the film closes with Man Friday preparing to leave the island after the rescue, along with Crusoe. Now we move on to autobiography and the Midsummer poems. This is a sequence of 54 untitled poems written from one summer to another in Trinidad, and thematically traces the relationship of poetry and painting. The season of midsummer and the attraction of the sea is there in the tropical islands. Walcott focused on his family and friends. Especially, he picturized his parents, his first wife and 2 daughters in these poems. We see these poems also as a record of the mid-years of his life and his poetical output. And right through these poems, we see a confluence of reality with memory. That is, of course, the imaginative and creative skills of the poet at work. He was influenced by writers and artists. One of the American poets who influenced Walcott a great deal was Robert Lowell. Now, Lowell's experience of his own family life, his marriage and his breakdown, and his own personal mental breakdown was also recorded in his poetry. And like Sylvia Plath, who also craved for privacy and then had also a mental breakdown, we see an enunciation of life that is echoed by Walcott. And therefore, along with the autobiographical tone, we might say this poetry is almost confessional. We also trace the memory of his father, Warwick Walcott, in these poems. And there is this legacy of the art that his father left behind for Derek Walcott that we again see in these poems. In fact, we see the influence of the Renaissance and the visual arts upon his words. There are references to Dutch artists and also the French painters, and in the 3 pictures you have below, I want you to particularly focus on the one that is the 3rd, extreme right, where you see Paul Gauguin's canvas. And I particularly mention this because Paul Gauguin too sailed away to Tahiti and lived on an island where he cohabited with the island girls, painted bright still life artwork with the vividness of color and beauty. All these artists used bright colors, but they kept also the darkness and the shadows, and we find this not just in Walcott's poetry, but also in his paintings. Now, there are also a number of sensuous images of color in the first of the selections in our text for study. There are shades of flame, rust and white, and Walcott writes, "The sun has fired my face to terracotta." We see the details of the landscape, the house. We see the description of his own face, all sunburnt, red. And when he says, "I cherish its wrinkles," he is talking about nature and the personal, because he is also talking about the wrinkles on the blue waters. There's lots of color in this house that waits on the steps. We can see how this is transferred, that it's not people waiting on the steps, but the house itself that waits upon its own steps. The whiteness of the porch and the sunlight seems to blaze out in the midsummer afternoon. And the long lines of the poems seem to stretch out the midday heat and its indolence. We also see Walcott's imagination quote a transparent Helen and the trifold references to Greek myths, and you may look at the map to see the area that he was thinking about. The figure of Helen who eloped with Menelaus is there, of course, in Homer's Iliad, and this brought the disastrous Trojan War. So he is perhaps thinking of the disasters that have been wrought on these Caribbean islands. But here Helen seems to be weightless and floating. He mentions Ionia smelling of burnt grass, evoking an image of the early Greek literature and philosophy and the fact that Troy too burnt in its final conquest. And then when he mentions Nike, he says, not Nike loosening her sandal. Nike is a figure of victory and of athletics, a figure with wings who wears golden sandals on her feet, but Walcott negates her. These island images of burning and stillness, they are built up image upon image like a painting, and we see the figure of Nike on the right hand side. He talks about the stunned afternoon. The muse of this inland ocean still waits for a name. So we see again the description of the interior as he waits, and he talks about the chairs that sweat. He also notices the lizard gasps and the sea glares like zinc. So again, the lizard and the sea takes human shape. Walcott loves personification, and he often brings this to the insects that he mentions in his poems. Then there are the contrastive images of light and darkness, which he sees when the girl slapping sand from her foot comes in. We wonder, is she real or is she just Nike recreated in his imagination again? Does he actually see a person coming in? Or because he is thinking of goddess Nike, does he associate the sand on an island girl's slippers with the golden sandals? Of course, Walcott's powers of nature and his rhetorical devices are most important. And therefore, when he mentions August, we wonder again, is it the girl or the month in Midsummer that he is talking about? He describes in the second text that we have for study the delay in the thunderclouds. He talks about the ropes of rain and sea grapes winds. Then he also talks about the housemaid August who runs into the yard to pull down the clouds. This is a quotation, but again we wonder, is he talking about a person or the season, especially as he gives us a simile like a laundress. So is it the weather, the changing season, that is bringing the clouds into his orbit? Or is he actually seeing a person coming to pick up the washed clothes? There is, of course, a passage of time, a year, and if you look at the cover of this book once again, you see almost a modern kind of sundial that is placed on it. We see in the poem guests and bathers, but there is the poet's fascination with insects, the gnats and the twig brown ant. He also invokes the weather goddess who could be his muse when he says, I quote, "The cloud passes high like a god staying his powers, the pocked sun dries, umbrellas reopen like flowers." So we see the poet's inspiration controlled by his imagination, a collage of pictures. There is a reference to books and children, and Walcott tells us about the intellectual experiences of life that come together in poetry. When he mentions the idolaters and God's face like sundials, he is again pointing out time versus the lethargy of the islanders and the fleeting hours of life that people experience in this new land, which is there as part of the old culture. We also see the American landscape of St. Thomas's Island. He talks about the chain link fence, which is quietly American, that is beyond the beach, and he mentions the baseball park. There seems to be an absence of sound because he talks about, quote, the absent roars and its holes muttering the word. So with the roaring and the muttering, he is of course focusing on sound once again, but he is talking now about umpire and empire as though he is talking about the control of the neocolonial powers through a supposed game. The colors also shift from grey to pink, and therefore we see a sea whose surface is as cold as Maine's. This is of course sunset, but he is couching this scene in American terms. He makes a reference also to the Second World War and the occupation of France by German forces, and therefore the coming of the night, leaving, I quote, a rank smell under the casuarinas, is speaking of war and devastation that comes in the aftermath of colonization too. American life, which is mechanical, seems to lack respect for the land, and he talks about the bulldozers that jerk and gouge out a hill. There seems to be a lack of dignity in this life, and he speaks of the illegal immigrants from unlucky islands who are envious, and they are like crabs scuttling around looking for work. So Walcott shows us how the lives of the people have altered. The colonizers have been replaced by rich holiday tourists, and he is satirical because he says the drizzle that falls now is American rain stitching stars in the sand. Therefore, he is once again evoking the natural beauty of the islands, but he feels that has been arrested from flourishing in the name of progress, which means destruction and rebuilding. The poet also says his own corpuscles are changing fast, which suggests a sense of dejection flowing in his blood. So we quote Walcott and we see, I fear what the migrant envies, the starry pattern they make, the flag on the post office, the quality of the dirt, the fealty changing under my feet. If we trace the poet's fears, it is that of losing his identity once again. And if we note the alliteration on the word F, we see these fears magnified. He is anxious about the takeover of the land by the rich Americans, and he is also conscious that the immigrants every day are arriving in hordes looking for work from other places, other colonized places, other islands. His sense of belonging among the flora and the fauna is shattered, and the peace of the island is also shattered. In fact, that word fealty takes meaning because fealty means sworn loyalty to the overlord, and this time there is a new overlord, maybe even more frightening than the colonizers were, and this is the overlord, the new colonizers or American power in the islands. So if we look at the closure of what 20th century means, we can look at the galley proofs of Midsummer 41, a poem almost towards the end of the sequence. If you look at the last line, he is giving us the shadows of the Second World War and the concentration camps. So he is suggesting that the poetry of privacy keeps hidden a voice of fear. He is also suggesting that migration and exile are now the new norms because people escape from torture and poverty, but they go into loneliness and poverty again. We see echoes of the Second World War, the frightening shadows of the concentration camps that have spilled across into other areas of life, even when people have managed to get away. We also see America representing the place of shelter and refuge, but upon its own terms of power and takeover of the new immigrants. And finally, of course, there's the poignancy of fealty changing, the loyalties changing, because the American dream and the struggling sense of possession that is offered to the immigrants come with also loads of responsibilities and burdens. Thank you.